Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. On the evening of November 8th, 2024, a small plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, carrying a 30-year-old woman from Maui named Hana Kobayashi. She had grown up on the island, the kind of place where the ocean is never far from view and life moves at a gentler pace than in the mainland cities she was about to pass through. Hana was not flying to Los Angeles to stay. Los Angeles was only a stop along the way, a single link in a longer chain that was supposed to end in New York City, where a connecting flight waited to carry her onward that same night. The plane landed at 9:53 in the evening. Somewhere in the 90 minutes that followed, in the crowded, fluorescent corridors of one of the busiest airports in the world, Hana Kobayashi made a decision that would set off a chain of events no one in her family could have imagined, one that would consume news cycles for weeks, draw in federal investigators, and ultimately cost her father his life. She did not board her connecting flight. The scheduled departure came and went at 11 o'clock that night, and Hana remained in the terminal instead, her New York City itinerary quietly abandoned. At the time, nobody watching security footage would have known to call this the beginning of anything significant. People miss flights every day for 100 mundane reasons, and airports are full of travelers who simply sit down for a while before deciding what to do next. But this was not an accident or a missed connection in the ordinary sense. What makes the early chapter of Hana's disappearance so unsettling, in hindsight, is that she did not vanish all at once. For the first several days, she remained visible, caught here and there on cameras and in the memories of strangers, like a thread you can follow only in fragments before it disappears into darker material. On November 9th, the day after she landed, surveillance footage and later witness accounts placed her at the Grove, the open-air shopping and entertainment complex in the heart of Los Angeles. She was seen inside Taschen Books, one of the boutique stores nestled among the plaza's cafes and cinemas, quietly charging her phone as though killing time rather than fleeing anything. It was a small, human detail, the kind of thing anyone might do while waiting between plans, and it gave no outward sign of crisis. The following day, November 10th, she appeared again at the same location, caught this time in footage connected to an event happening at the Grove. She still looked, by every account gathered afterward, unharmed and composed. To anyone glancing at her, she would have seemed like just another young woman spending a weekend in Los Angeles, wandering through shops, in no apparent danger and showing no visible signs of distress. It is a strange feature of many disappearances that the people who cross paths with the missing in these final ordinary days rarely sense anything is wrong, because there is often nothing yet to see. The danger, if there was to be any, was still gathering somewhere behind the scenes. Then came November 11th, the day that as the last day anyone heard clearly from her. On that Monday, Hana's mother, Brandy Yee, reached out with a text message that could have been sent by any mother checking in on a traveling daughter. She asked simply whether Hana had made it to New York. The answer that came back was no. It was a small, almost mundane admission, buried inside an otherwise unremarkable exchange. But it was also the last clear, coherent communication Hana's family would receive from her for weeks. Around the same time, a different and far more troubling message reached one of Hana's friends. Hana had sent a text describing concerns that her identification had been stolen. She wrote, with what reads now as chilling ambiguity, that she was worried someone she thought she had loved was trying to take her money. The friend, alarmed by the strangeness of the message, alerted Hana's family, setting off the first real current of concern that something might genuinely be wrong. That evening, Surveillance cameras captured Hannah once more, this time far from the shopping plazas of the Grove. She appeared on footage inside a downtown Los Angeles Metro rail station, the Pico station, in the company of an unidentified individual. At 10:03 that night, the same cameras recorded her leaving the station together with this unknown person. It is one of the last visual records anyone has of Hannah Kobayashi before the trail runs cold for nearly 2 weeks. A single grainy image of a woman walking beside a stranger into the Los Angeles night. Her family thousands of miles away in Hawaii with no idea that the daughter and sister they loved was about to disappear from view entirely. There was, buried in the flight records and baggage systems of LAX, one more clue that investigators would only piece together later. Hannah had originally checked her luggage through to New York, exactly as a passenger continuing her journey would do. But at some point, she changed her mind and asked that the bag be redirected back to her at LAX itself. Surveillance footage confirmed she personally retrieved that bag from the baggage carousel on November 11th, the same day as her last known messages. It was a small logistical detail, but one that investigators would later treat as evidence that whatever was happening to Hannah, she was still making active decisions about her own possessions and her own path, not simply a victim swept away by someone else's plan. For her mother and sister, the silence that followed November 11th was unbearable. Hannah's sister, Sydney, became the family's public voice in the days that followed, speaking to reporters and posting updates as the search for her sister widened. The family did not accept, in those early weeks, the theory that Hannah had disappeared on purpose. Based on the surveillance footage they had been shown and the information shared with them, Sydney told the public plainly that it did not appear Hannah had intentionally missed her flight, a statement that stood in direct and painful tension with what investigators would eventually conclude. Missing person reports were filed. Hannah's case gained attention first locally and then nationally, her photograph circulating alongside descriptions of the last places she had been seen. Volunteers and family members combed through the neighborhoods around LAX and downtown Los Angeles, driven by the desperate hope that persisted in every missing person case, that somewhere out there, she was simply lost or frightened or unable to call home, rather than gone in some more permanent and terrible sense. Into this search came Hannah's father, Ryan Kobayashi, 58 years old, who flew from Hawaii to Los Angeles to help look for his daughter himself. It is one of the most human details of this entire story, a father unwilling to simply wait by the phone for updates, choosing instead to walk the same streets and terminals where his daughter had last been seen, hoping that his own eyes might find something the police had missed. For nearly 2 weeks, Ryan searched the area around the airport, carrying with him all the anguish and helplessness that comes from not knowing whether the child you raised is alive or dead, safe or in danger, waiting to be found or already beyond finding. The search for Hannah had already stretched more than 2 weeks when, on November 24th, an entirely new and devastating tragedy struck the family. Ryan Kobayashi's body was discovered early that Sunday morning in a parking lot near LAX, at a business address just off the airport's perimeter. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner would later rule his death a suicide, attributing it to multiple blunt force traumatic injuries consistent with a fall. It is difficult to write about this moment without pausing to sit with its full weight. A father had crossed an ocean to search for a missing daughter, walking the unfamiliar streets of a city far from home, carrying a fear that must have grown heavier with every day that passed without word. And somewhere in the crushing uncertainty of that search, in a grief and desperation that ultimately became unbearable, Ryan Kobayashi's own life ended, near the very airport where his daughter had last been seen. His family, informed of his death while still not knowing what had become of Hannah, released a statement describing what they called an unfathomable, devastating tragedy. For a family already suspended in agonizing uncertainty about one loved one, this second loss did not simply add to their pain, it multiplied it, layering fresh grief onto an already unbearable weight. News of Ryan's death transformed the case from a regional missing person story into a national one. Reporters who had been following the search now had a second, harder question to ask. Not only where was Hana Kobayashi, but what kind of situation could produce a tragedy of this magnitude before anyone even knew whether she was alive? For 8 more days after Ryan's death, the investigation continued without a breakthrough that the public could see. Then, on December 2nd, Los Angeles Police Chief Jim McDonnell stood before reporters and delivered a set of facts that reframed the entire case. Detectives, he explained, had obtained and reviewed surveillance footage from United States Customs and Border Protection at the San Isidro port of entry, the border crossing linking San Diego to Tijuana, Mexico. That footage clearly showed Hana Kobayashi crossing the border on foot, alone, carrying her own luggage, and appearing unharmed. The timestamp read 12:13 in the afternoon on November 12th, the day after her last known contact with her family. The path she had taken to reach that border became clearer as investigators traced her movements. At around 6:10 in the morning on November 12th, Hana had purchased a ticket at Union Station in downtown Los Angeles and boarded a bus heading south. The journey took roughly 4 hours, ending near the border, where she then walked through the pedestrian tunnel leading into Tijuana entirely on her own. There was no sign in the footage of coercion, no visible companion forcing her forward, nothing to suggest she was being trafficked or held against her will. She simply walked calmly into another country. Chief McDonnell told the assembled reporters that investigators had also reviewed Hana's old social media posts and found she had, at some point before her disappearance, expressed a desire to step away from modern connectivity, to disconnect from the constant tether of phones and screens that defines so much of contemporary life. Her phone itself appeared to have been left behind in Los Angeles, never carried across the border with her. Based on all of this evidence, the LAPD made the decision to reclassify Hana's case, changing her status from an active missing person investigation involving possible foul play to what they termed a voluntary missing person case. It was a resolution and a rupture at the same time. On one hand, it offered a kind of relief that the darkest fears of abduction, of trafficking, of violence appeared not to be supported by the evidence police had gathered. On the other hand, it opened an entirely new and different kind of pain for Hana's family. The possibility that she had chosen, of her own free will, to walk away from them, to leave no explanation, and to remain silent through weeks of frantic searching and a father's death, all without picking up a phone to say she was safe. Chief McDonnell, addressing this tension directly, said that Hana had a right to her privacy and that the department respected her choices, while also acknowledging how deeply her loved ones continued to worry and how a single message from her could ease so much of that pain. Just as the public was absorbing the idea that Hana had left the country on her own accord, the story deepened again, this time in a direction almost nobody had anticipated. In early December, unnamed sources began telling reporters that Hana had secretly married a man named Alan Cacace, an Argentine national, sometime before her disappearance. According to these accounts, the marriage was not born of romance but of arrangement, allegedly intended to help Cacace obtain legal immigration status in the United States. More troubling still, sources suggested the scheme had not originated with Hana at all, but had instead been orchestrated by someone closer to her, her former partner, a man named Ammonius Muniz Miranda. The pieces began arriving from multiple directions at once. Reporters learned that Hana had reportedly been traveling toward New York not entirely alone in spirit, if not in fact, accompanied in some accounts by both her ex-boyfriend Muniz Miranda and by Cacace, the man she had allegedly married. One source close to the situation described tension within this arrangement, suggesting that Muniz Miranda harbored jealousy over Hana's marriage to Cacace, even though the union had apparently been his own idea in the first place, a suspicion that soon drew the attention of investigators looking into whether he had played a coordinating role in the scheme. Confirmation of the marriage's existence came not only from anonymous sources, but from something far more concrete: paperwork. Hana's mother, searching through her daughter's belongings back home in Hawaii, discovered immigration documents and records of contact with an immigration attorney. These were not the kind of items an ordinary traveler carries by accident. Brandy turned everything over to the FBI and to LAPD detectives, who now had physical evidence to examine alongside the border crossing footage and the surveillance history built over the preceding weeks. The revelations forced a difficult recalibration for everyone following the case. An LAPD spokesperson was careful to clarify that Hannah herself was not considered a suspect in any criminal activity connected to the alleged scheme, a distinction that mattered enormously to a family already reeling from grief and confusion. If a fraud had taken place, the shape of the story suggested Hannah might have been a participant led into it, or perhaps even something closer to a person used within it, rather than its architect. But the full truth of her role, and of what exactly had transpired between her, Cacase, and Muniz Miranda, remained genuinely unclear even to the investigators piecing it together in real time. The uncertainty of early December gave way, finally, to relief on December 11th, when Hannah's family released a statement through their attorney, Sarah Azari, announcing that Hannah had been found safe. Sydney and Brandy Yee's words, brief and heavy with exhaustion, conveyed both the depth of what the family had endured and the fragile gratitude of the moment. They described themselves as incredibly relieved and grateful, and asked, gently but firmly, for privacy as they began the long process of recovering from everything they had lived through over the preceding month. The statement did not disclose exactly where Hannah was or how her safety had been confirmed, and for several more days a degree of mystery persisted even after the most frightening possibilities had been ruled out. Then, on December 16th, Hannah crossed back into the United States on her own, without incident, closing the loop that had opened when she walked south through the San Isidro Tunnel more than a month earlier. A day later, on December 17th, Hannah broke her own silence publicly for the first time. The statement, sent from her aunt's phone rather than her own, reflected a woman choosing her words carefully after weeks of being discussed, speculated about, and searched for by people who loved her and people who had never met her. She said she was prioritizing her well-being in the aftermath of everything that had happened, an understated but telling phrase given the whirlwind of events behind it. A missed flight, a border crossing, a secret marriage, a father's death, and a month-long search that had gripped a nation's attention. With Hannah confirmed safe and back in the country, and with Customs and Border Protection notifying the department of her re-entry, the LAPD formally closed her case as a voluntary missing person matter. Investigators reiterated what they had said weeks earlier. They had found no evidence that Hannah had been trafficked, coerced, or victimized by foul play during her time away, though questions about the alleged immigration marriage scheme and the roles played by Cacase and Muniz Miranda remained, at least publicly, unresolved. The story of Hannah Kobayashi resists the easy shape. There was no single villain unmasked in a courtroom, no definitive answer to why she disappeared the way she did, and no tidy explanation for the choices she made during those weeks she spent, by all appearances, moving through the world according to her own private logic rather than anyone else's. What remains instead is a portrait of ambiguity, an outline built from surveillance footage, text messages, and the fragments of documents her mother found in a house on Maui. What is not ambiguous is the human cost that surrounded her disappearance. A father who loved his daughter enough to fly across an ocean and walk the streets of a strange city, searching for her, did not survive the weeks of not knowing. A mother and sister who spent a month in public anguish, defending their belief that something had happened to Hannah against a police narrative suggesting she had left willingly, were left afterward to reconcile both possibilities as best they could, grieving one loss while processing the return of someone they feared they might never see again. And Hannah herself, whatever combination of intention, manipulation, fear, or desire for escape drove her actions, returned to a family and a public forever changed by 5 weeks in which her name became inseparable from a story far larger and stranger than any single explanation could contain. There is no dramatic courtroom scene to end this story, no verdict read aloud to a hushed gallery. There is only a young woman who came home in December 2024, quieter and more private than the version of her that had dominated headlines, asking simply for the space to heal, and a family left to carry forward both their profound relief at her safe return and the permanent absence of the father who never got to see it. Story 2. Coleraine sits where the River Bann meets the Atlantic coast of Northern Ireland, a modest market town whose rhythms in the late 1980s were set less by commerce than by faith. Church bells, prayer meetings, and Sunday school outings shaped the calendar for many families there, and nowhere was that rhythm steadier than within the close congregation of the local Baptist church. It was a community that prided itself on decency, on neighbors who knew each other's children by name, and on the quiet certainty that the people sitting beside you in the pew were exactly who they appeared to be. Two families anchored themselves in that world, the Howells and the Buchanans. Colin Howell was a dentist, charismatic and well-regarded, married to Leslie, a devoted mother of 4 young children. Trevor Buchanan was a Royal Ulster Constabulary officer, steady and respected, married to Hazel, who worked as a nursery assistant and taught Sunday school with quiet enthusiasm. Their families crossed paths often, at church socials, at the playgroup where their children played together, in the ordinary overlapping of small-town life. Nobody watching them in 1989 could have imagined the horror that would eventually be traced back to this unremarkable web of friendship. It began, as so many devastating things do, with something that felt at first like simple companionship. Colin Howell and Hazel Buchanan grew closer through their shared involvement at the church playgroup. What started as friendly conversations slowly deepened into something neither of them had intended, and by 1990 the two were engaged in a secret affair, each betraying a spouse who trusted them completely. For a while the secrecy itself seemed to feed the intensity of what they felt. They met wherever they could, snatching private hours away from the lives their families believed were solid and unshaken. It was a peculiar cruelty of the arrangement that the very community which might have caught them, the tightly knit church family, was also the audience they most feared exposing them. Secrets rarely survive long in small towns, and this one did not either. Members of the congregation began to notice the closeness between Colin and Hazel, the lingering glances, the private conversations that stretched too long. Eventually their spouses found out, and the affair became impossible to hide. Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan, devastated by the discovery, were told what many betrayed partners are told, that it was over, that it would never happen again, that the marriage and the family and the faith would be enough to hold everything together. For a brief period it seemed as though it might be true. The affair appeared to end, and life in Coleraine resumed its familiar shape. But beneath the surface calm, something had shifted permanently. By early 1991 the relationship between Colin and Hazel had resumed, this time carried out with even greater secrecy, and it would later emerge with a darker undertone. Whatever guilt either of them felt was not enough to end what had begun. Instead, as the weeks passed, the affair curdled into something far more dangerous than infidelity. Colin Howell would later admit that he had come to see his wife and Hazel's husband not simply as inconvenient obstacles to a forbidden romance, but as the last barrier standing between himself and the life he believed he deserved. Divorce, forbidden within the strict moral framework of their church community, was not an option either of them felt they could take. If they could not divorce their way to freedom, Colin began to reason, perhaps there was another way. The 18th of May, 1991, fell on a Saturday, and it happened to be the second birthday of Colin and Leslie Howell's youngest son. In any ordinary household, that date would be remembered for balloons and cake, for a toddler's delighted shrieking, for a family photograph tucked into an album. Instead, it became the date that shattered two families and, though nobody could have known it then, would not be fully understood for almost 20 years. That night, as her children slept upstairs, Leslie Howell settled into the family living room. She had no reason to fear her husband, no reason to suspect that the man she had married 8 years earlier, the father of her 4 children, was at that moment preparing to kill her. Colin had rigged a length of garden hose to the exhaust pipe of the family's Renault Savannah, feeding the other end through a gap into the house. As the engine ran and the carbon monoxide fumes seeped into the room, Leslie began to lose consciousness. But she did not die quietly. She woke, gasping, and in a moment of desperate clarity she cried out for her eldest son, Matthew, then just a young boy asleep in his room upstairs. Colin restrained her, holding her down as the poison continued to do its work, until at last she stopped struggling and the life went out of her. What followed was almost inconceivably calculated for a man who, by every outward appearance, was a devoted husband and father only hours earlier. Colin placed his wife's body into the boot of the car, covering it with a bicycle to disguise the shape beneath, and drove out into the night. Along the way he passed a police patrol car without incident, an unbearable detail that would later add to the anguish of those investigating the case, a reminder of how close discovery had come and how completely it slipped away. Colin's destination was the home of Trevor and Hazel Buchanan in Charnwood Park, Coleraine. Hazel was waiting for him. She opened the garage door for her lover and made certain that her husband, Trevor, was where he needed to be, asleep in an unsuspecting house that had no idea a killer had just arrived at its door. Trevor, a police officer trained to sense danger, had no warning that the threat that night came not from some stranger in the dark, but from a man his wife had brought quietly into his own home. Colin repeated the same method he had used on Leslie, feeding carbon monoxide fumes toward Trevor as he lay defenseless. But Trevor did not go as easily. He woke and fought back, and in the ensuing struggle Colin sustained a gash to his forehead, an injury serious enough to leave a visible mark that police would later see and, tragically, accept as nothing more than an incidental bump when they interviewed him in the days that followed. Trevor's injuries, visible on his body and later documented in post-mortem photographs, including trauma to the back of his head and to his nose and mouth, told a story of a man who had struggled desperately for his life. Colin would later claim there had been a minor row between them earlier that day, an explanation the original investigators accepted far too readily. With both his wife and his lover's husband now dead, Colin loaded Trevor's body into the same car that already held Leslie's. He drove on toward the small seaside town of Castle Rock, stopping briefly to leave the bicycle he had used to disguise Leslie's body at a nature reserve along the way, discarding evidence with the same chilling composure he had shown throughout the night. In Castle Rock stood a garage belonging to Leslie's own father, a detail that would later strike investigators and the public alike as one of the case's cruelest ironies. Colin backed the car into the garage and arranged the two bodies inside the vehicle with deliberate care. He positioned Leslie in the back seat, clutching photographs of her children, with headphones over her ears playing religious music, a scene designed to evoke a woman overwhelmed by guilt and grief who had chosen to end her own life. Trevor was placed in the front seat, slumped as though he too had simply given up. Colin ran the hose from the exhaust back into the car and left the engine running, ensuring that when the bodies were found, the scene would tell a story of two broken-hearted spouses who, upon discovering their partner's affair, had chosen death together rather than face the shame of it. Once the scene was set, Colin ran along Castle Rock Beach under cover of darkness to avoid being seen, burned the clothing he had worn that night to destroy any trace of evidence, and cycled home as though nothing at all had happened. By morning, he was simply a grieving husband, and Hazel was simply a grieving wife. The bodies of Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan were discovered in that fume-filled garage, and to the officers who responded, the explanation seemed almost to present itself. Here were two people whose spouses had been having an affair, found together in a sealed car with the engine running. The conclusion reached was that Leslie and Trevor, devastated by betrayal, had ended their own lives together in a tragic pact, even though the truth was that they were not, and had never been, lovers themselves. The inquest that followed accepted the theory of a suicide pact, and the file on the deaths of Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan was closed. For the wider community of Coleraine, and for the families left behind, this verdict brought a particular compounded grief. Not only had they lost a wife, a husband, a mother, a father, but they had been left to carry the added burden of believing that their loved ones had chosen to leave this world voluntarily, in despair, rather than being taken from it by violence. Children grew up believing their mother had killed herself. A community mourned two people they believed had succumbed to shame, rather than accepting that two of their own had been murdered by people they trusted. Colin Howell and Hazel Buchanan, freed of the spouses who had stood between them, became an open couple after the funerals. For a time it must have seemed to them that they had, in the coldest possible sense, succeeded. They remained together for roughly 5 years before eventually separating. Hazel later remarried, becoming Hazel Stewart, building a new life with her second husband, David, and continuing to raise her children in the same town where the truth of what she had done remained buried. Colin, for his part, went on to meet Kyle Jorgensen, an American woman who had recently moved to Coleraine and joined the same church community. Drawn in by his apparent devoutness and his easy charisma, Kyle knew nothing of what lay beneath the surface of the man she was falling for. They married after a courtship of only a few months and went on to have several children together. But secrets of this magnitude rarely stay buried forever, even when they are hidden for years. In 1998, 7 years after the murders, Colin sat his wife Kyle down at their kitchen table while their infant son fed nearby and their older children played outside, and he confessed. He told her he had been unfaithful to his first wife. He told her he had murdered her. And then he told her the second, almost unthinkable part, that he had also killed the husband of the woman he had been having an affair with, and had arranged their bodies together to make it look as though they had taken their own lives. Kyle was left reeling, forced to carry the unbearable weight of that knowledge while continuing to live alongside the man who had confessed it, terrified of what exposure might mean for her family, and unsure whom she could trust with such a secret. For more than a decade after that confession to his second wife, Colin continued to live a double life of extraordinary duplicity. He remained an active figure in his church, a respected professional in his community, all while carrying the truth of a double murder inside him. During these years, further disturbing behavior surfaced, including additional infidelities and a pattern of abusing sedated patients in his dental practice, abuses that would only come to full light later. He also lost a substantial sum of money in a fraudulent investment scheme and endured the devastating death of his eldest son, Matthew, who died after falling from an apartment building in Russia in 2007. Colin felt both the financial collapse and his son's death as punishments sent by God for what he had done, a belief that appears to have weighed on him with mounting corrosive force. By 2009, the pressure of carrying this secret had become, for Colin, unbearable. Encouraged by his wife Kyle, who urged him that he would never truly be free unless he was honest, Colin made the decision that would finally unravel 18 years of silence. On the 28th of January 2009, he went to the elders of his church and confessed everything, naming Hazel as his accomplice and providing every detail he could recall of the night of the murders. The church elders, faced with a confession of this magnitude, urged him to go to the police, and he did. What followed was a reopening of a case that had been closed for almost 2 decades. Detectives from the Police Service of Northern Ireland began reinvestigating the deaths of Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan, this time armed with a confession from one of the 2 people responsible. Colin Howell and Hazel Stewart were arrested and charged with murder in February 2009. Both initially denied the charges, and for 2 intense days of questioning after her arrest, Hazel maintained her innocence before finally breaking down. In a recorded police interview later played in court, jurors listened as Hazel, in tears, admitted her involvement in the plan and apologized for what had happened, describing how she had helped facilitate the poisoning of her own husband and Colin's wife. Colin Howell's case moved first. Rather than face a trial, he pleaded guilty to both murders on the 18th of November 2010. In December of that year, at Belfast Crown Court, Mr. Justice Anthony Hart sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years, meaning he would not be considered for release until at least 2031. In delivering the sentence, the judge did not soften his words. He described the killings as truly heinous crimes, calling them cold-blooded, carefully planned, and ruthlessly executed, carried out against two people who Howell had come to see as obstacles standing in the way of his adulterous desire to be with Hazel. Hazel Stewart's trial followed in February and March of 2011 at Coleraine Crown Court, and it drew intense public attention across Northern Ireland and beyond. She denied the charges throughout, and unlike Colin, she chose not to take the witness stand to give her own account of events, leaving the jury to weigh the evidence without hearing her personal defense directly. Colin, by contrast, gave extensive testimony against her, describing in detail how he had proposed the murder plan to her during a meeting in her car on an isolated road roughly a week before the killings, and stating that she had shown no moral objection to the idea of murdering their respective spouses. Her defense rested largely on the claim that she had acted under duress, manipulated and controlled by Colin's dominant will, a claim the court ultimately did not accept as sufficient to excuse her actions. The jury deliberated for a relatively short time before returning their verdict. Hazel Stewart was found guilty of both murders. She sobbed as the verdict was read, and the trial judge, when sentencing her, made a particular point of noting that she could have prevented Trevor's death, that at multiple points she might have chosen a different path and had not. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years before she could be considered for parole. Uncomfortable questions were raised about how the original 1991 investigation had gone so badly wrong. It emerged that investigators at the time had overlooked several details that, in retrospect, should have raised immediate suspicion. The driver's side window of the car had been left open, an odd detail for a supposed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in a sealed space. Trevor's leg had been found hanging out of the open car door, another detail inconsistent with the tidy narrative of a planned joint suicide. A witness had even told police at the time that Colin had previously attempted to harm his wife, information that appears not to have been meaningfully pursued. Perhaps most damning of all, Colin himself had directed police to the exact garage where the bodies were found on 3 separate occasions before the discovery, a behavioral detail investigators failed to interrogate. The Police Service of Northern Ireland later issued a formal apology to the families of Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan for these failures, acknowledging that the original inquiry had missed vital clues that might have exposed the truth far sooner. There was also the matter of what Colin gained materially from his wife's death. Following Leslie's passing, he received a life insurance payout of £400,000, a sum that, in the cold light of the later confession, cast an even darker shadow over the calculated nature of what he had done. The convictions did not end the revelations about Colin Howell's conduct. In May 2011, shortly after Hazel's trial concluded, Colin pleaded guilty to further charges of assaulting patients in his dental surgery, admitting to abusing several women while they were under sedation during what should have been routine dental procedures. This betrayal of professional trust, layered atop the murders, further cemented the public image of him as a man capable of extraordinary deception across every part of his life. He was stripped of his National Health Service pension as a consequence, and additional years were added to his sentence for these crimes. For those closest to the case, the pain did not end with courtroom verdicts. Kyle Jorgensen, Colin's second wife, had spent over a decade carrying the burden of his confession before the truth became public, protecting her children from a horror she alone had known about. When Colin finally went to the police in 2009, Kyle chose to return to the United States with their children, desperate to shield them from the storm of public attention that was about to break. She later spoke publicly about the devastating discovery that the man she had believed to be a devout, gentle Christian had, in fact, been a murderer and an abuser hiding behind a mask of faith for years. Hazel Stewart's own family remained divided in their response even after her conviction. Her husband, David Stewart, continued to believe in her innocence, visiting her regularly in prison, as did her 2 children, Andrew and Lisa, who found themselves grappling publicly with the pain of having a parent convicted of murder, while also feeling that the sins of Colin Howell had permanently altered how their mother would be remembered. Hazel pursued several appeals against her conviction in the years that followed, none of which succeeded in overturning the jury's verdict. A story about two ordinary families in a small northern Irish town, torn apart not by strangers or by chance, but by people they loved and trusted completely. Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan were both only in their early 30s when their lives were taken from them. Their children left to grow up believing, for nearly 2 decades, a false and painful story about how their parents died. It took the slow, grinding weight of guilt, religious conviction, and a series of personal catastrophes to finally break Colin Howell's 18-year silence. And it took the courage of investigators willing to revisit a case long since closed to finally deliver something resembling justice, however delayed, to the memory of two people whose deaths had been quietly, deliberately, and almost successfully erased from the truth. Story 3. The quiet of Halloween morning in Hays, Kansas, was shattered by the frantic voice on the 911 call. It was October 31st, 2019. The man on the other end of the line was Colby Trickle, and his words were a torrent of panic and grief. His wife, 26-year-old Kristen Trickle, had shot herself, he said. He had woken to his ears ringing and found her beside him in their bed, a gunshot wound to her head. In the sterile, procedure-driven world of emergency response, it was a call that signaled a tragedy, another soul lost to despair. But as first responders arrived at the home, the scene that greeted them began to whisper a different, more sinister story. Sergeant Brandon Hopman was one of the first officers to step across the threshold. Years of experience had trained him to notice the details that didn't fit, the small dissonances that could turn a straightforward case into a complex puzzle. Kristen was lying in bed, clad only in her underwear. The weapon, a large caliber revolver, rested near her neck. For a woman of Kristen's small stature, the gun seemed awkwardly large, a heavy, unwieldy instrument for a final, desperate act. Hopman's instincts flared. Something felt wrong. Another detail hummed in the background, a persistent, almost mocking counterpoint to the grim silence of the room. A phone alarm, ringing over and over. Detective Joshua J.B. Burkholder eventually silenced it. He later reflected on its significance, noting that people who have decided to end their lives don't typically set alarms. They don't have plans for the day. The future has already been erased. Kristen's alarm suggested she had intended to get up, to get ready for her job at the local Walmart's garden center, to live another day. It was a small, electronic ghost of a future that had been violently stolen. Colby Trickle, his face a mask of tear-streaked sorrow, was taken to the station for an interview. He was cooperative, readily agreeing to speak with investigators without a lawyer. He recounted the hours leading up to the tragedy, painting a picture of domestic normalcy. He and Kristen had come home, played video games, and he had gone to bed before her. He claimed he woke to the sound of the gunshot, his ears ringing, and discovered his wife dying beside him. In his telling, he rushed to her side, checked for a pulse he couldn't find, and then called 911. He also admitted to picking up the revolver from her body, confessing that for a fleeting, terrible moment, he considered turning it on himself before the dispatcher on the phone reminded him that help was on the way. While Colby was weaving his tale of shock and grief, Kristen's family was receiving the worst phone call of their lives. Her aunt, Delynn Rice, was plunged into a state of disbelief. "Kristen is dead. She's been shot," her mother told her. The words didn't compute. It didn't make sense. The Kristen they knew was not someone who would do this. She had hopes and dreams. She had talked about opening her own dog grooming or pet boarding business. She was a young woman with a future she was actively planning. Despite the unsettling details at the scene and the family's immediate doubts, the official ruling came swiftly. Just 3 days after Kristen's death, the coroner, Dr. Lyle Nordhoek, declared it a suicide. The case was, for all official purposes, closed. Colby Trickle was a grieving widower, free to go on with his life. But for the investigators who had stood in that bedroom, the case was anything but closed. The image of the large revolver, the sound of the incessant alarm, the very position of Kristen's body, it all amounted to a deep, nagging suspicion that refused to fade. And soon, Colby Trickle's own actions would fan those embers of doubt into a full-blown blaze of inquiry. With the coroner's ruling in hand, Colby Trickle was free to collect on his wife's 2 life insurance policies, which amounted to a payout of over $120,000. The money that was meant to provide a safety net in the face of unimaginable loss became, in Colby's hands, a fund for a new life, one that seemed utterly detached from the memory of his deceased wife. Within 8 months, the entire sum was gone. He spent thousands on video games and music equipment, nurturing a fantasy of becoming a performer. He paid off his debts. But it was one purchase in particular, made just 2 days after he received the insurance money, that sent a shockwave of disgust through the investigation and Kristen's family. Colby spent nearly $2,000 on a life-size, realistic doll. Detective Burkholder found the purchase deeply concerning. "There's a mourning process that I think everyone needs to go through when a loved one dies," he stated. And to have him ordering this type of doll just months after his wife's death was concerning. For Kristen's aunt, Delynn Rice, the act was a grotesque betrayal. "I was just appalled that he would use Kristen's life insurance money for a doll," she said. "It just was like he bought a replacement of her with her money." When questioned, Colby's mother, Tina Kreutzer, would later testify at his trial that the doll was for warmth and comfort, to help him sleep through the nightmares that plagued him after his wife's death. Kristen's uncle, Brant Rice, dismissed the explanation with cutting pragmatism. "We have electric blankets we use for that." The investigators, now more suspicious than ever, began to dig deeper into Colby Trickle himself. They discovered he had been exchanging flirtatious Snapchat messages with another woman, a fact he had not disclosed. They also uncovered a web of lies he had spun about his past. During his interviews, he had shared elaborate stories about a distinguished military intelligence career, with dangerous tours in the Middle East and Central America. However, a check with the military confirmed that Colby Trickle, a soldier in the Army Reserve, had never been deployed overseas. He had also initially lied about the existence of the life insurance policies, telling investigators only that he had a policy on himself through the military. The man who presented himself as a grieving hero was proving to be a compulsive fabulist. The inconsistencies at the scene, coupled with his bizarre spending and a pattern of deceit, convinced the investigators they were not looking at a suicide, but a homicide. The challenge was proving it. The initial coroner's ruling was a significant hurdle. They needed a new way to look at the evidence, a way to peer into Kristen's state of mind in the days and weeks before her death. This led the prosecutor, Aaron Cunningham, to a novel and controversial approach, something never before used in a Kansas criminal case, a psychological autopsy. Cunningham was troubled by the physical evidence, particularly the revolver. "It's awkward to maneuver, not something that you'd easily turn on yourself," he reasoned. He believed Colby had killed his wife and was now hiding behind the initial suicide ruling. The defense attorney, Cassie Ziegler, argued that Colby's frantic 911 call while Kristen was still showing signs of life pointed to his innocence. With the physical evidence being interpreted in 2 starkly different ways, Cunningham decided the key lay not in the physical autopsy of Kristen's body, but in a forensic examination of her mind. A psychological autopsy is an attempt to reconstruct the deceased's state of mind to determine the probability of suicide. It involves interviewing family, friends, and colleagues, and analyzing personal documents, communications, and online activity. Dr. Ashley Christensen, a psychologist, was hired to conduct this deep dive into Kristen's life. For nearly 2 years after Kristen's death, she meticulously gathered data, speaking with those who knew Kristen best and even interviewing Colby himself. Dr. Christensen's findings, when presented at the trial, painted a powerful picture. She testified that in the time leading up to her death, Kristen was exhibiting signs of hope, not despair. She had been talking to family members about her future plans, specifically her dream of opening a pet-related business. She was looking forward, not looking for a way out. During her interview with Colby, Dr. Christensen uncovered another critical inconsistency. Colby claimed that Kristen was aware of his online relationship with the other woman, and that they had discussed it the week she died. This directly contradicted what he had told police in his initial interview, when he claimed he didn't think Kristen knew. The prosecution seized on this. Did she know or not? The shifting story suggested a man trying to retroactively create a motive for his wife's supposed suicide. Ultimately, Dr. Christensen concluded her testimony with a carefully worded but impactful professional opinion. She told the jury that, based on all the data she had gathered, Kristen was at a low risk for suicide at the time of her death. It is my opinion that it is relatively less likely that her death was the result of suicide, she stated. While the defense attorney criticized the report as speculative, arguing that one can never truly know the mind of another, the autopsy of the mind had given a voice to Kristen, telling a story of hope that stood in stark contrast to the defense's narrative of despair. On July 14, 2021, 21 months after Kristen's death, the slow, grinding wheels of justice finally caught up with Colby Trickle. He was arrested and charged with murder in the first degree and interfering with law enforcement for falsely reporting information. The trial began in September 2023. The prosecution laid out its case brick by brick. They presented the suspicious circumstances at the scene, the large gun, the phone alarm. They detailed Colby's web of lies about his military service and the insurance money. They told the jury about the flirtatious messages with another woman. And of course, they introduced the shocking purchase of the sex doll, portraying it not as an item of comfort, but as a cold and immediate replacement for the wife he had just murdered. The psychological autopsy served as the cornerstone of their argument, allowing Dr. Christensen to testify about Kristen's hopeful state of mind and the unlikelihood of suicide. The prosecution argued that Colby, perhaps fearing Kristen had discovered his infidelity or simply wanting to cash in on the insurance policies to fund his fantasies, decided to kill her and stage it to look like she had taken her own life. The defense fought back, arguing that the entire case was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. They emphasized that Colby had called 911 himself and that Kristen was still alive when he did so. They attacked the psychological autopsy as unscientific and inadmissible, a subjective report prepared by someone who had never even met Kristen. They presented Colby as a grieving, traumatized husband whose odd behavior was a product of his immense loss, not a confession of guilt. For Kristen's family, the trial was an agonizing ordeal. They listened to the defense attempt to cast doubt, knowing that all it would take was one juror to believe it was reasonable. What are we going to do if he walks out a free man? They worried. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned with a verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the foreperson spoke. On the charge of premeditated murder in the first degree, the jury found the defendant, Colby Trickle, guilty. A wave of relief washed over Kristen's family. It was a feeling of being able to breathe again, a sense of safety returning to their lives. Justice, which had seemed so distant and uncertain for so long, had finally been delivered. In November 2023, more than 4 years after he made that frantic 911 call, Colby Trickle was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 50 years. In the aftermath, Dr. Lyle Nordhoek, the coroner who had made the initial suicide ruling, admitted he had made his determination before speaking to Kristen's family or even seeing the weapon used to kill her. He stated his intention to amend Kristen Trickle's death certificate to officially change the cause of death from suicide to homicide. It was the final, official acknowledgement of the truth the investigators and Kristen's family had suspected from the very beginning. Kristen Trickle did not give up on her life. It was stolen from her. The case that began with a lie on a Halloween morning had ended with a hard-won, somber truth. Story 4. The house on Terra Noble Way sat quiet on the afternoon of September 8, 2018. The kind of quiet that belongs to a street where everyone minds their own business and nobody expects anything to go wrong. Inside, a woman named Karen Navarra moved through the small rituals of an ordinary Saturday. She was 67 years old, a pharmacy technician who had spent 45 years behind the same counter at Regional Medical Center in San Jose, filling prescriptions with the same patient hands day after day, year after year. She lived alone in the house she had made her own, with a handful of cats for company and a Fitbit Alta HR strapped to her left wrist, quietly counting her heartbeats without either of them knowing it would one day speak for her when she no longer could. Karen was, by every account gathered afterward, a private person. She had never married, had no children, and kept a small circle that barely extended past her co-workers at the pharmacy. One of them, a woman named Amber Ashfeck, had known her for 3 decades, working the counter beside her, trading pleasantries, sharing shifts, but never quite crossing into friendship outside those fluorescent-lit hours. They were friendly, not close. Karen was the type of person who let very few people pass the front door of her life, and fewer still pass the front door of her house. That afternoon, a car pulled into her driveway. It was a small, dark gray Toyota Corolla, the kind of car that blends into a suburban street without drawing a single glance. Behind the wheel was a man named Anthony Aiello, whom everyone called Tony. He was 90 years old, married to Karen's mother, Adele, which made him Karen's stepfather, a fixture in her family for years, a man who had, by his own account, only ever meant her kindness. That day he brought her a gift that felt almost tender in its ordinariness, a homemade pizza, wrapped in aluminum foil on a white paper plate rimmed in blue, and a batch of biscotti he had baked himself. He cut the pizza into equal pieces, kept 3 for himself and his wife, and drove the rest over to Karen's house at around 3 in the afternoon. Karen let him in, delighted to see him, and immediately began eating a slice while it was still warm. He stayed only 15 minutes. When he left, she walked him to the door and handed him 2 roses, a small, sweet gesture between a stepfather and the stepdaughter he had known for most of her adult life. Then he drove straight home. Same day, while standing outside his own house on Mira Vista Circle, he heard a car horn, looked up, and saw Karen's car passing by, a stranger in the passenger seat he could not identify. He waved. She waved back, and that was the last he ever saw of her alive. It was a simple story, warm even, the kind of small-town anecdote that makes you feel briefly good about the world. It would turn out to be almost entirely false, and the machine on Karen's wrist would be the one to prove it. 5 days passed. Karen did not show up for her shift at the pharmacy, which was unlike her. 4.5 decades of near-perfect attendance does not break for nothing. On September 13th, Amber Ashfeck grew worried enough to drive to the house on Terra Noble Way and check on her co-worker in person. She found the front door unlocked, which itself was strange, and she pushed it open into a silence that told her something was deeply wrong before she even saw the body. Karen was in the dining room, slumped in a wooden chair at the table, her head tipped backward over the chair's back, her legs stretched out in front of her. It looked, for one terrible instant, like she might simply be asleep. She was not asleep. She had a gaping laceration across her neck, and there were wounds visible on the top of her head. In her right hand was a large kitchen knife. 2 other chairs at the table had been knocked over and lay on the floor. Drawers in the bedroom and dining area had been pulled open, as if someone had searched the house or wanted it to look that way. Beneath her head, a water bowl on the floor had filled with dried blood, and blood had sprayed across the countertop and the drapery nearby. To the first officers on scene, the tableau seemed to tell its own story. A lonely, isolated woman, a knife in her hand, wound to her throat. It looked, on its surface, like suicide, but something about it did not sit right, and the officers, trusting their instincts, called in the homicide unit rather than close the case on first impression. That instinct would prove to be the difference between a case that vanished into a filing cabinet marked self-inflicted, and one that would eventually make headlines around the world. The following morning, September 14th, investigators from the Santa Clara County Coroner's Office began the autopsy. What they found dismantled the suicide theory within hours. When the medical examiner, Dr. Parson, shaved portions of Karen's scalp to get a clear look at her injuries, she uncovered wounds far more severe than anyone had first realized, multiple skull fractures, deep and intrusive gashes to the head and face, injuries so extensive that the skull itself had been broken apart in several places. Dr. Parson explained plainly that some of these wounds would have been instantly incapacitating. There was no way, she said, that Karen could have inflicted them on herself. The likely weapon was something with a sharpened, heavy edge, more akin to a small hatchet or axe than the kitchen knife found resting so deliberately in her hand. It was, in other words, a staged scene. Someone had killed Karen Navarra and then arranged her body and the knife to make her death look self-inflicted, hoping investigators would see a sad, lonely woman who had ended her own life and move on without asking further questions. It was a chilling piece of theater, and it very nearly worked. Detectives now needed answers, and they turned first to family. Karen's mother, Adele Aiello, was 92 years old and married to Tony Aiello, the man who had visited Karen days earlier with pizza and biscotti. When detectives Brian Meeker and Sergeant Montanai arrived at the Aiello home on Mira Vista Circle that same afternoon to deliver the devastating news, Tony opened the door himself and invited them inside. They sat together at the kitchen table, and the elderly couple described Karen as a recluse, someone who kept to herself, who spent her free time with her cats, who had not been romantically involved with anyone in years. It was Tony who first told them, unprompted, about his visit on September 8th. The pizza, the 15 minutes, the car horn, the roses. It seemed, at that early stage, like nothing more than the last kind gesture in the life of a woman who died soon after. Nobody in that kitchen imagined that the mild, elderly man serving them the story was about to become the center of one of the most talked about criminal investigations in the country. Investigators, working the case methodically, noticed something on Karen's body that most people would have overlooked entirely. A Fitbit Alta HR fitness tracker still fastened to her left wrist. It was a small, unremarkable object, the kind millions of people wear to count their steps and track their sleep, and it had kept working quietly and faithfully, recording her heartbeat every 15 minutes, long after anyone had reason to look at it. Detective Meeker understood immediately what that device might mean. If the Fitbit had recorded her heart rate up until the moment of her death, and if that timestamp could be matched against other evidence like security footage, it might reveal not just when Karen died, but who else was present at that exact moment. The device could not accuse anyone by name. It could only report numbers, spikes, and silences. But numbers, unlike people, do not lie, do not forget, and do not construct convenient stories to protect themselves. There was, however, a problem. The Santa Clara County Crime Lab did not have the technical capability to extract the stored data themselves. The company that made the device was based in San Francisco, and getting access to it meant filing for a search warrant, something Detective Jennings did on September 19th, presenting the request to a judge, the Honorable S. Chapman, who found good cause and approved it. Fitbit's own director of brand protection, a man named Jeff Bonham, personally drove down to San Jose Police Department to take custody of the device himself, treating it correctly as one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. While the request for the Fitbit data worked its way through the courts, another team of investigators, led by video forensic technician C. Triggs, began the tedious work of canvassing the neighborhood for security footage, hoping to corroborate or dismantle Tony Aiello's account of that Saturday afternoon. The canvass turned up two crucial cameras. One, mounted outside a home on Noble Avenue, covered the very stretch of road where Tony claimed Karen's car had passed him while he stood outside, honking, waving, a stranger in the passenger seat. If her car had truly driven that route at that hour, as Tony described, it should have appeared clearly on the footage. It never did. Karen's car did not appear anywhere on that camera during the window Tony described. The wave, the horn, the mysterious passenger, all of it, according to the video evidence, simply never happened. The second camera, positioned near Karen's own house, told an even more damning story. It recorded in short motion-triggered clips rather than continuously, but its footage was unambiguous. At 2:58 in the afternoon, Karen's driveway was empty. By 3:12, A small dark gray car matching the description of the Aiello's Toyota Corolla had appeared, parked in the driveway. It remained there through subsequent clips at 3:14, 3:19, 3:21, and 3:33. By 3:35, the car was gone. In total, the vehicle had sat in Karen Navarra's driveway for at least 21 uninterrupted minutes, not the 5 to 15 minutes Tony Aiello had described to police. It was a small discrepancy on its own, the kind of thing memory might simply get wrong after the passing of a stressful, grief-filled week. But small discrepancies, when placed beside the right piece of evidence, can become enormous. On September 20th, Fitbit's Jeff Bonham finally reported back with the extracted data from Karen's device. What it showed sent a chill through the investigation. The Fitbit had recorded a significant spike in Karen's heart rate at 3:20 in the afternoon on September 8th, precisely the window in which the security footage placed Tony Aiello's car in her driveway. That spike was followed by a sudden, rapid slowing. By 3:28 p.m., the device had stopped registering any heart rate data at all. It simply went silent 8 minutes after it spiked, and it never recorded another human pulse again. The video showed Tony's car remaining in the driveway until at least 3:33 p.m., 5 minutes after Karen's heart had already stopped. According to Tony's own account, he had been inside dropping off pizza, chatting warmly, receiving roses at the door as he left, all during a window in which, according to her own body, Karen Navarra was already dying or already dead. The device had recorded via Bluetooth, syncing its data every 15 minutes to a nearby paired device, and Karen's desktop computer sat only 5 to 10 feet from where her body was later found in the dining room, close enough for the two devices to talk to each other reliably. The clock on the Fitbit servers and the clock on the security cameras ran on the same synchronized internet time. There was no ambiguity to exploit, no room for a defense built on faulty timestamps. Whatever forgiveness memory might offer a 90-year-old man recalling a stressful afternoon, the numbers offered none. Investigators now believed they understood what the staged suicide scene had been built to hide. Karen Navarra had not died from a single act in a moment of despair. She had suffered a violent, sustained attack, struck repeatedly about the head with something heavy enough to fracture her skull in multiple places, and someone had then taken the time, in the aftermath, to place a knife in her hand and cut her throat to manufacture the appearance of self-harm, hoping investigators would look no further. On September 25, 2018, a Santa Clara County judge, the Honorable P. Collin, reviewed and approved both a RAMI warrant for Tony Aiello's arrest on a charge of murder and a search warrant for the Aiello home on Mira Vista Circle. The following day, September 26th, San Jose's Covert Response Unit located and arrested Anthony Vincent Aiello. He was 90 years old, walking with the aid of assistants, and now facing a charge that would make him, according to his own family, quite possibly the oldest person ever held without bail on a murder charge in the history of Santa Clara County, and perhaps the country. While Aiello was being taken in for questioning, crime scene investigators searched his home under the newly issued warrant. In the master bedroom closet, they found a pair of men's pants with visible reddish-brown stains near the knees. In a clothes hamper in the converted garage where Tony spent much of his time, they found a white tank top and a gray button-down shirt, both marked with small reddish-brown spots across the front. Presumptive chemical testing on all three garments came back positive for blood. Investigators also swept the sinks in both the garage living area and the master bedroom, using a chemical reagent designed to reveal blood that had been washed away and was no longer visible to the naked eye. Both sinks tested positive as well, suggesting an attempt to clean up after the fact. Inside the interview room, Detectives Montanay and Meeker read Tony his rights and asked him to walk through his account once more. He repeated, almost word for word, the story he had given days earlier. The pizza, the 15 minutes, the car horn, the roses at the door. When confronted directly with the Fitbit data and the security footage placing his car in the driveway for far longer than he claimed, and well past the moment Karen's heart had stopped, Tony insisted it could not be true. She had walked him to the door, he said. She had handed him flowers. How could she have already been dead? When detectives explained that the internet-synchronized clocks on both systems left no room for error, Tony denied ever being present when Karen was killed and suggested, without offering any name or detail, that someone else might have been inside the house that day. Asked about the bloodstains found on his clothing, he said he cut himself often and might have shaken his hand while wearing those shirts, scattering droplets across the fabric. Investigators pointed out that the pattern on the shirts was consistent with a spray or splatter rather than a few dripped spots, a detail that did not fit his explanation. When the interview ended and the detectives stepped outside the room, they could hear Tony Aiello talking quietly to himself. Among the things he repeated, more than once, were three simple words: "I'm done." Aiello was formally charged with first-degree murder with the personal use of a deadly weapon. He pleaded not guilty in April 2019, appearing in court in a wheelchair, using an assisted hearing device, his arms shackled at his sides, a portrait of frailty that made the courtroom itself feel like an argument for his defense before a single witness had spoken. His attorney, Edward Caden, pushed repeatedly for bail on the grounds of Tony's failing health, but the request was denied each time, and he remained in custody at San Jose's main jail without bail for nearly a year. In August 2019, a grand jury handed down an indictment against him, and his case appeared, finally, to be moving toward trial. His legal team hoped proceedings could begin by December. But time, which had already worked so heavily against him in the courtroom, ran out in an entirely different way. Aiello's health had been deteriorating for months, and his daughter had publicly said he was, in her words, dying in jail while waiting for his day in court. On September 11th, 2019, just over a year after Karen Navarra was found dead in her dining room, Anthony Aiello died in custody. He was 91 years old. His attorney confirmed the death and noted it came a year and 2 days after Karen's killing. Under standard legal protocol, when a defendant dies before their case is resolved, the charges against them are dismissed. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office confirmed exactly that. The case against Anthony Aiello was formally closed, not because he was found innocent, and not because he was ever proven guilty in a courtroom, but because death itself had removed him from the reach of the justice system before a jury ever had the chance to weigh the evidence. Karen Navarra's murder was never resolved in the way the word resolved usually implies. No trial ever took place. No jury ever heard the Fitbit data laid out against the video timestamps. Never got to watch a defense attorney try to explain away a heartbeat that stopped 8 minutes into a 15-minute visit. Tony Aiello maintained his innocence until the end, and with his death, the presumption of innocence that the law affords every defendant became, in a strange and permanent way, unbreakable. He was never convicted. He was also never cleared. Investigators stated plainly that they had no other suspects and no intention of reopening the search for one, since the evidence they had gathered pointed, in their view, only toward the man who had died before he could answer for it. What is left, in the absence of a verdict, is the case itself. A woman who lived quietly and asked little of the world, found dead in a chair in her own dining room, her death staged to look like a choice she never made. What is left is a small wearable device, never designed with anything like this purpose in mind, that ended up doing what neighbors, cameras, and even careful police work alone might not have managed on their own, giving a silenced woman one last chance to tell investigators, in the language of heartbeats and timestamps, that something was terribly wrong. And what is left, finally, is the uncomfortable, unresolved truth that sits at the center of so many real cases that never make it to a jury. That justice, however diligently pursued, does not always arrive in time to deliver the ending anyone is hoping for. Karen Navarra's neighbors still remember her as the quiet woman with the cats, the one who kept to herself, who worked the same pharmacy counter for nearly half a century without complaint. She never sought attention in life, and the case that bears her name was never really about spectacle. It was about a small, stubborn piece of technology on her wrist that refused to let her death be misread, even when everything around her had been arranged to ensure exactly that. Story 5. In the quiet suburbs of Wilmington, Delaware, where the air carried the faint salt of the nearby Atlantic and the streets were lined with tidy brick homes and blooming dogwoods, Mark and Jenner Gerardo had built a life that seemed, from the outside, unremarkably solid. It was the kind of existence that neighbors envied. Two professionals in their 40s, childless by choice but devoted to a rotating cast of rescue dogs and cats. Their evenings filled with walks along the Brandywine River or quiet dinners at home, discussing the day's small triumphs and frustrations. Mark, with his easy smile and creative flair, had always been the dreamer, sketching ideas for ad campaigns on napkins during their travels. Jenner, sharper-edged and fiercely loyal, was the anchor, the one who remembered birthdays and balanced the checkbook, her laughter quick but her temper, when roused, a storm that passed as swiftly as it came. They had met as teenagers in the summer of 1986 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a flat, unassuming city where the Wabash River wound lazily through cornfields and factory hums. Mark was 16, lanky and awkward, the 11th child in a sprawling Catholic family that filled their modest home with chaos and warmth. His father, a stern but fair factory worker, and his mother, who juggled waitressing shifts with raising the brood, had instilled in him a quiet resilience. Jenner Cox, a year older at 17, was from a smaller family. Parents Earl and Becky, who ran a small accounting firm, and a younger sister, Jill, whom Jenner doted on like a second mother. Jenner was bold where Mark was hesitant, her dark hair framing a face that could shift from playful grin to determined scowl in an instant. She spotted him at a community pool party, fumbling with a volleyball, and teased him mercilessly until he laughed, the ice broken. What began as shared popsicles and late-night drives in her father's old Chevy blossomed into a young love that carried them through high school uncertainties. By the time they graduated, the bond had deepened. Mark pursued a bachelor's in design at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, emerging with a portfolio of bold graphics and a quiet ambition to shape stories through visuals. Jenner, ever the planner, enrolled at Butler University in Indianapolis, studying communications, her nights spent poring over textbooks while Mark sketched beside her. They married on October 23, 1993, in a simple ceremony at a local chapel, surrounded by family and friends who toasted to their future. At 23 and 24, they felt invincible, two kids from the Midwest, ready to conquer whatever lay ahead. No children came, a decision born of mutual agreement. Their lives were full with careers and pets, the pitter-patter of tiny paws sufficing for the family they craved. Their early years were a whirlwind of relocation, chasing opportunities that pulled them across state lines like threads in a tapestry Mark might design. From Indiana, they ventured to South Carolina in 2011, drawn by the promise of warmer climates and fresh starts. Mark landed a role in marketing for a coastal development firm, his creativity turning bland brochures into vibrant invitations to paradise. Jenner, with her communications degree, joined him in the field, her organizational skills making her indispensable in event planning and client relations. They settled in a beachside cottage in Myrtle Beach, where the ocean's rhythm became the soundtrack to their renaissance. Mornings were for jogs along the shore, feet sinking into wet sand as gulls wheeled overhead. Evenings for bonfires where they'd recount the day's absurdities, a client's botched logo or a vendor's endless delays, until laughter dissolved the stress. It was here, amid the salt spray and palmettos, that Jenner's insecurities began to whisper, though Mark dismissed them as the toll of constant upheaval. The cracks, subtle at first, widened in 2017. Jenner lost her job in a corporate restructuring, her confidence fracturing like glass under pressure. Applications piled up unanswered. Interviews yielded polite rejections that stung like slaps. Mark, sensing her withdrawal, suggested another move, Delaware this time, where he'd spotted a posting for a creative director at the University of Delaware. The salary was promising, the campus historic and bustling. Jenner supported it, though her eyes held a shadow of reluctance. "As long as we're together," she said, squeezing his hand, her voice steady but her grip a fraction too tight. Mark arrived in Newark, Delaware, in August 2017, 6 weeks ahead to settle into the role. The university's marketing department hummed with energy, a far cry from the sleepy coastal gigs. His supervisor was Meredith Sullivan Chapman, 33, a rising star whose resume read like a highlight reel. Former television reporter in Newark, communications director at UD, and a 2016 candidate for Delaware State Senate in the 8th District, where she'd campaigned on education reform and women's rights with a charisma that filled rooms. Meredith was petite, with auburn hair that caught the light like autumn leaves, and eyes that sparkled with unyielding drive. She'd grown up in nearby New Castle, the eldest of 3 siblings in a family that prized achievement. Her father a school administrator, her mother a nurse, both beaming at her wedding to Luke Chapman, a financial planner and former Newark City Councilman, in 2009. Mark's first interaction with Meredith was an email exchange. His inquiry about the job met with her prompt, enthusiastic reply. The interview followed swiftly, held in her corner office overlooking the quad, where students milled like purposeful ants. She leaned forward, elbows on the desk, firing questions that peeled back his professional layers. "What story would you tell if you could redesign the world?" she asked, her smile disarming. Mark, caught off guard, stumbled into a monologue about hidden narratives and everyday chaos, his hands gesturing as if painting the air. She laughed, a bright, unforced sound, and hired him on the spot. "You get it," she said. "We need more of that." The attraction simmered from there, unspoken at first. Late nights in the office, poring over campaign mock-ups, led to shared coffees that stretched into lunches. Meredith's marriage to Luke had cooled. 9 years in, the spark dimmed by his long hours and her relentless ambition. They shared a home in Newark, a dog named Indy who tolerated their growing distance, but whispers of separation lingered. With Mark, conversation flowed like wine, his quiet introspection balancing her electric energy. One evening in late September, after a successful launch event, they lingered at a campus bar, the hum of colleagues fading as they talked dreams. Her regret over the Senate loss, his nostalgia for Midwestern simplicity. A brush of hands over a drink, a lingering gaze, and the line blurred. By October, stolen kisses in her car after hours confirmed what their hearts had already decided. It was intoxicating, this forbidden vitality, a reminder that life could still surprise. Back in South Carolina, Jen Eyre packed their lives into boxes, her days a blur of real estate listings and farewell lunches. Mark's calls grew shorter, his voice laced with fatigue she attributed to the new job's demands. When she arrived in Wilmington in December 2017, renting an apartment overlooking the Christina River, the chill in their home was palpable. Mark was distant, his eyes drifting to his phone. Jen Eyre, unpacking dishes with mechanical precision, felt the weight of unspoken words. Their lovemaking, once a bridge across rough patches, became obligatory, laced with her probing questions. "How's Meredith?" she'd ask casually over dinner, watching his fork pause midair. "She's great, sharp as a tack," he'd reply too quickly, his smile not reaching his eyes. The suspicions gnawed at her like termites in wood. Jen Eyre had always been intuitive, the one who sensed storms brewing. Late one night in January 2018, as Mark slept on the couch after a late meeting, she slipped his thumb onto his phone's reader, the screen blooming with notifications. Screenshots piled up, flirty texts, Snapchat streaks that vanished like smoke, coordinates from a GPS app she'd installed on his car under the guise of shared commuting. Over 400 images captured their intimacy, whispered affections, plans for secret weekends. The betrayal hit like a tidal wave, drowning her in rage and grief. How could he? After 24 years, the moves, the sacrifices? She transcribed every damning word into 12 spiral notebooks, her handwriting neat but furious, pages filling with timelines of deceit. But Jen Eyre didn't confront him outright, not yet. Instead, she armored herself in surveillance. She sewed tiny recording devices into the hems of his jackets, their microphones capturing murmurs in coffee shops and sighs in elevators. A private investigator's software hacked his emails, revealing hotel bookings and love letters that twisted her gut. She tracked Meredith's sleek SUV with another GPS, mapping their rendezvous: a secluded beach in Rehoboth, a dimly lit bistro in Philadelphia. The knowledge was a poison she couldn't expel, fueling sleepless nights where she'd pace the apartment, the dogs whining at her feet, sensing her turmoil. By Valentine's Day 2018, the dam broke. Over a tense dinner at a riverside restaurant, Jen Eyre laid it bare: printouts of messages, audio clips playing on her phone like indictments. Mark's face drained of color, his denials crumbling into confession. "It just happened," he stammered, tears welling. "She's everything I forgot I needed." Jen Eyre's world shattered. She didn't scream. Instead, a cold resolve settled. "Fix this," she said, her voice ablade. They agreed to counseling, sessions with a divorce coach named Sheila Brennan, where Mark spoke of amicable splits and Jen Eyre nodded, her smiles brittle masks. Behind the facade, darkness festered. In the weeks that followed, Jen Eyre's obsession with Meredith deepened into hatred. She scoured social media, piecing together the younger woman's life. The Senate run, where Meredith had charmed crowds with promises of progress. Her role at UD, innovating digital campaigns that won awards. Her recent promotion to assistant vice president at Villanova University, prompting a move to a charming red brick townhouse on Lowry's Lane in Radnor Township, Pennsylvania, a quiet enclave of manicured lawns and wrought iron fences, just 20 miles from Philadelphia's bustle. Meredith's separation from Luke finalized in March, her posts glowing with newfound freedom, Indy the golden retriever bounding beside her on runs through nearby arboretums. Jen Eyre's research turned predatory. She drove to Villanova's campus, blending into the throng of faculty, noting Meredith's routines: early arrivals, yoga classes at noon, evenings unwinding with wine and podcasts. Binoculars from a hunting store scanned the townhouse's windows, earplugs muffling the highway's drone during stakeouts. A secret bank account, opened days after the confession, funded it all. The Taurus Tracker .357 revolver purchased legally in early April from a Delaware gun shop, its weight foreign in her anti-gun hands. She visited a firing range 3 times, the acrid smoke and recoil bruising her resolve into steel. For protection, she told the clerk, but her mind rehearsed trajectories, the heft against her palm. The notebooks multiplied, entries dated like a diary of descent. March 15th, saw them at the park. Her hand on his arm, mine once. April 5th, gun feels heavy but justice weighs more. A 15-page letter took shape, emailed drafts to her parents, Earl and Becky, detailing the payback. "This is for the life you stole," she wrote of Meredith, her words a litany of lost years. Plan B haunted the margins. If Mark interrupted, the bullet was his. She envisioned it, a triangle of reckoning, ending in shared silence. Meredith, oblivious, thrived in her new chapter. The Villanova job invigorated her, collaborating on alumni campaigns that harnessed social media's pulse. Her family, parents in Newcastle, siblings scattered but close, rallied around her divorce, toasts at gatherings laced with optimism. "You're free now," her sister said over brunch, clinking glasses. Luke, amicable in their split, co-parented Indy seamlessly. Evenings, Meredith texted Mark from her sunlit kitchen, the townhouse's exposed beams and hardwood floors a canvas for fresh memories. "Can't wait for dinner," she'd type, unaware of the shadow lengthening across the threshold. April 23rd, 2018, dawned crisp, the main line's elms budding green against a sky bruised with clouds. Mark woke early in Wilmington, the apartment's silence oppressive. Counseling had plateaued. He'd told Jen Eyre that morning he wanted the divorce formalized, Delaware's 6-month separation ticking down. She nodded, eyes distant, then suggested dinner that night, a neutral ground to talk logistics. Relief washed over him, perhaps closure beckoned. At the office, Meredith buzzed with plans for a client pitch, her laughter echoing as they brainstormed over sketches. "You're brilliant," she murmured, brushing his shoulder, the touch electric. Jen Eyre moved with mechanical grace that day. She dressed in black, leggings, hoodie, sneakers silent on tile, tucking the revolver into a backpack alongside gloves, a wig of mousy brown to mask her dark bob, and a change of clothes for escape. A rental Cadillac XTS, black as midnight, waited curbside. She slid behind the wheel at 1 p.m., the engines permasking her pounding heart. The drive to Pennsylvania blurred, interstate hum, radio static, dropping her at a gas station near Radnor at 2:40, receipt time-stamped like an alibi. She parked blocks from Laurie's Lane, binoculars scanning the empty driveway, earplugs dulling the world to her breaths alone. The townhouse loomed, its red brick warm in afternoon light, flower boxes spilling tulips. The front door's lock yielded to a credit card's edge, glass shards swept meticulously from the frame, no crunch to alert. Inside, the air smelled of fresh paint and Meredith's citrus candles, Indy's toys scattered like carefree confetti. Jen Eyre moved through rooms with ghostly tread, the living room's plush sofa where lovers might linger, the bedroom's unmade bed evoking intimacies she'd imagined in torment. She chose the kitchen, heart of the home, where Meredith would pause for water after her drive. Hiding behind the island's granite counter, revolver cold in her lap, she waited. Hours stretched, shadows lengthening across slate floors. Doubt flickered, turn back, seek therapy anew, but the notebook's words anchored her. Payback. Meredith's SUV crunched gravel at 6:45 p.m., engine cutting to silence. Keys jingled in the lock. The door swung open, her footsteps light, purse thumping on the hall table. Indy? Home early today, she called, though the dog was with Luke. Flip-flops slapped tile as she entered the kitchen, fridge humming open for a bottle of seltzer. The shot cracked like thunder, a single .357 round to the chest, Meredith crumpling face down, seltzer shattering in a fizzing arc blood pooled, dark and viscous, a mere flick on her calf as she twitched, eyes wide in shock. Jen Eyre rose, steady, the recoil's echo fading. No words, only the deed's finality. The revolver's barrel tasted of metal and powder as Jen Eyre pressed it to her temple. One breath, a fleeting image of Mark's boyish grin at the pool, their first shared sunset in South Carolina, and the trigger yielded. The second shot boomed, her body slumping beside her victim, black-clad form inches from the vibrant life she'd extinguished. Blood mingled on the floor, a grim tableau in the gathering dusk. Mark waited at the restaurant, a cozy Italian spot in Wilmington, checking his phone at 6:50. Text from Jen Eyre. Wrong turn, running late. Then, not coming. Go home. A photo followed, trash bin contents, a condom amid wrappers, his stomach lurching. You ruined my life, the next read. I hope you never find happiness. By Mark. Panic surged, he bolted, tires screeching toward Pennsylvania, heart hammering. Text to Meredith went unread. Call straight to voicemail. The townhouse's lights glowed mocking as he pulled up at 7:05, door ajar, glass glinting oddly. Meredith? No answer. Inside, the kitchen's horror unfolded, Meredith prone, blood haloing her curls. Jen Eyre crumpled nearby, the wig askew, revolver loose in slack fingers. He stumbled back, dialing 911 with trembling hands. Two down, blood everywhere. The dispatcher echoed his hysteria. Radnor police swarmed, lights strobing the quiet street, neighbors peering from curtains. Mark, wild-eyed and collapsing on the lawn, babbled confessions, the affair, the texts, the dread. Officers cuffed him briefly, protocol for the man linked to both dead women, then released as evidence mounted. Jen Eyre's rental car with its arsenal of intent, the letter emailed to her family at 6:30, detailing the justice served. The investigation peeled back layers like an onion, each revelation stinging investigators and survivors alike. Radnor Superintendent William Colariolo, a veteran of domestic horrors, called it calculated revenge, pieced from digital breadcrumbs. Jen Eyre's phone logs showed range visits, gun shop visits. Backups revealed the surveillance empire. GPS pings, hacked snaps sowed spies. No prior record marred her name, but experts like psychotherapist Dr. Roby Ludwig later analyzed the descent. Betrayal's alchemy turning grief to fury, isolation amplifying the echo. She couldn't bear the loss, Ludwig noted. so she authored the end. Mark, adrift in numb shock, faced interrogation's glare. Why her? Why not you? Detectives pressed. He had no answer, only fragments. Jenner's anti-gun pacifism clashing with the revolver's purchase, her pleas for reconciliation masking the plot. Released after hours, he wandered Philadelphia's pre-dawn streets, the city's hum indifferent to his unraveling. Jenner's family, Earl and Becky in Fort Wayne, received her letter's digital ghost, chilling entries dated weeks back, justifying the act as marital martyrdom. They grieved in silence, a private funeral at Covington Memorial Gardens claiming her ashes, whispers of our girl lost to pain. Meredith's death rippled wider, a theft from a community that revered her. Colleagues at Villanova mourned the innovator who'd just unpacked boxes, her desk still strewn with pitch notes. Family statements painted her as a beacon, her Senate bids fire undimmed by loss. Luke, stoic in grief, navigated shared custody of memories, Indy's wines and nightly lament. Friends gathered in Newcastle, toasting her boundless energy, the 5 a.m. runs, the impassioned debates, vowing her legacy in advocacy funds. For Mark, the aftermath was a labyrinth of regret. He resigned from UD amid scandal's shadow, the university's HR probing the affair's ethics. Therapy unpacked the passivity that let cracks widen, the thrill of Meredith blinding him to Jenner's signals. I broke her heart, he confessed in interviews, voice cracking, made her feel no choice remained. By 2019, he relocated to California, founding Intrepid Brand Consulting in Carlsbad, where ocean views mocked his inland scars. Pets Again, a lab mix named Huck, filled quiet homes, but sleep evaded, haunted by kitchen floors slick with accusation. The human cost tallies not in bullets but breaths withheld, the what-ifs of earlier words, the might-have-beens of mended bonds. Betrayal's shadow stretches long, but in its umbra, flickers of awareness. Reach out, listen deeper, offer faint reprieve. For in the quiet after the shot, only questions remain, echoing across the divides we build and breach. Story 6. In the heart of Denver's Observatory Park neighborhood, where tree-lined streets whispered of suburban tranquility and families built lives under the vast Colorado sky, Richard and Christine Kirk had carved out what appeared to be an ordinary existence. Richard, a man in his late 40s with bright blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, worked as a project manager, his days filled with the steady rhythm of spreadsheets and deadlines. Born on May 15, 1966, he had grown up in a world far removed from the spotlight, but his life had always carried an undercurrent of tension, a short temper that simmered just below the surface, road rage that flared in traffic, and a dependency on painkillers for a nagging back injury that had plagued him for years. Christine, or Chris as her loved ones called her, was the warm counterbalance to his edges. At 44, she was a devoted mother with a gentle spirit, her days revolving around her 3 young sons, Ethan, Aiden, and Andrew, aged 13, 11, and 7. She worked part-time, managing the chaos of family life with a quiet strength, though whispers among friends hinted at cracks in the foundation of their marriage. Their home on South Garfield Street was a modest 2-story haven, filled with the laughter of children and the everyday clutter of toys and school books. But beneath the surface, strains pulled at the seams. Financial difficulties loomed large, bills piled up, and arguments over money echoed through the walls. Chris had confided in a colleague just months before that she no longer loved Richard, that she wanted to tell him but feared the fallout. Her family noticed his nasty streak, the way he seemed always on the verge of losing control, though he never raised a hand against her. Richard, for his part, admitted the relationship was rocky, normal couple problems, he would later say, but he loved his boys and clung to the life they had built. In early 2014, Colorado's newly legalized recreational marijuana offered a potential escape from his Vicodin addiction. Edibles, those innocuous candies infused with THC, promised relief without the stigma of pills. Little did he know one small purchase would unravel everything. The evening of April 14, 2014, started like any other. The sun dipped low over the Rockies, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood as Richard ran errands after work. His back ached, a constant companion, and with his prescription painkillers running low, he stopped at a local dispensary. Recreational marijuana had been legal for just a few months, and the shelves brimmed with colorful options. He browsed for nearly 20 minutes, his mind weighing the unfamiliar choices. He settled on a Karma Candy Orange Ginger Chew, a Tootsie Roll-like candy containing over 100 milligrams of THC, far exceeding the state's recommended single dose of 10 milligrams. It seemed harmless, a simple way to ease his pain and break free from opioids. He paid, tucked it away, and headed home, the wrapper crinkling in his pocket like a secret. Inside the house, Chris was winding down the day with the boys. Dinner had been served, homework checked, and the children were scattered. Ethan in his room, Aiden perhaps playing a game, and little Andrew lingering nearby. Richard arrived, exchanged pleasantries, and retreated to unwind. Secretly, he nibbled a portion of the candy, waiting for the effects to kick in. Marijuana wasn't new to him in concept, but edibles were uncharted territory. He expected relaxation, a gentle numbing of his aches. Instead, as the clock ticked past 10 p.m., something shifted. The high didn't come quickly. It built slowly, insidiously, like a storm gathering on the horizon. At first, it was subtle, a warmth spreading through his limbs, a haze clouding his thoughts. But then paranoia crept in. Richard began pacing the living room, his movements erratic, his voice rising in confusion. He ranted about the end of the world, apocalyptic visions spilling from his lips. Chris watched with growing alarm, her heart pounding as she tried to calm him. The boys, sensing the tension, hovered on the edges, their young faces etched with fear. Richard climbed in and out of a first-floor window, scraping his shins on the sill, lying on the bedroom floor and begging someone, anyone, to kill him. His fixation turned bizarre. He obsessed over the numbers in their home address, 2112, demanding one of his sons recite them over and over. "Dad, it's 21 to 12, February 1st, 12, the boy stammered, his voice trembling. Chris's fear escalated. This wasn't her husband. This was a stranger, unraveling before her eyes. She urged the children to their rooms, trying to shield them from the chaos. Richard fumbled with the family safe in the bedroom, his fingers clumsy on the lock. Inside lay a pistol, kept for protection in their quiet neighborhood. Chris's pulse raced. Why was he going for the gun? She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice a mix of desperation and terror. "My husband is totally hallucinating," she told the dispatcher, her words rushed and breathless. "He's scaring me and my kids. He just took some marijuana, and he's freaking out. He has a gun, and he's trying to get it out of the safe." The dispatcher tried to keep her calm, asking questions to assess the situation. But in the background, Richard's voice grew louder, more unhinged. "Richard, please stop. Please stop. Please stop," Chris pleaded, her tone rising in pitch as he retrieved the weapon. The boys were nearby, Ethan and Aiden perhaps peeking from doorways, Andrew close enough to see the horror unfold. The youngest, just 7, would later carry the image like a scar, his father, gun in hand, pressing it to his mother's head. Chris stayed on the line, her final words a frantic bid for help. Then a single gunshot shattered the night. The line went silent, save for the dispatcher's urgent calls. Chris slumped to the floor, a fatal wound to her head, her life extinguished in an instant. Chaos erupted. The boys' screams pierced the air as Richard, still in a daze, wandered into one of their rooms. He offered the gun to his youngest son, mumbling for the boy to shoot him, a moment that would haunt the child for years. Police sirens wailed in the distance, arriving within minutes to a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Officers found Chris lifeless in the bedroom, the phone still clutched in her hand, the 911 call recording every harrowing second. Richard was arrested on the spot, his eyes glassy, his demeanor detached, as if waking from a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. Toxicology tests would later reveal only trace amounts of THC in his blood, 2.3 nanograms per milliliter, below the state's impairment threshold for driving. But an empty hydrocodone bottle hinted at mixed substances. though no opioids showed in his system. The neighborhood reeled. Observatory Park, with its manicured lawns and sense of safety, suddenly felt vulnerable. Word spread quickly. A husband had killed his wife after eating a marijuana edible. Their 3 boys left orphaned in the blink of an eye. Chris's family, her mother Marty Konk, stepfather Wayne, and sister Tammy Heeman, rushed to the scene, their world collapsing. Marty, a woman in her 60s with a background in finance and later mental health counseling, had always sensed something off about Richard. "We're not surprised he shot someone," Wayne told reporters, "but we didn't think it would be a family member." They had watched Chris endure emotional abuse, the constant tension of a troubled marriage. 3 months before the shooting, Chris had confided in them about wanting to leave Richard, though it's unclear if she ever voiced it to him. In the immediate aftermath, the boys were whisked away to their grandparents' home, a place of solace amid the storm. Marty and Wayne, now in their 70s, stepped into the role of guardians, adopting the children formally. The youngest, Andrew, struggled most visibly, nights spent clinging to his grandmother, begging her to erase the image from his mind. "I can get the picture out, but can you just help get that out of my head?" he would plead. Ethan and Aiden, older but no less scarred, navigated grief in silence, their childhoods forever altered. The family attended counseling, balloon releases on Chris's birthday, anything to honor her memory and heal the wounds. Investigators pieced together the puzzle. Receipts and security footage confirmed Richard's purchase of the edible at Nutritional Elements dispensary. The half-eaten candy was found in the home, its packaging lacking clear warnings about potential psychosis or hallucinations, issues that would later fuel a lawsuit. Prosecutors charged Richard with first-degree murder, arguing premeditation born from marital strife, not intoxication. He had the presence of mind to remember the safe's code, they said, and pressed the gun to Chris's head while she begged for help. But Richard's defense countered with a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming the edible induced delirium, a psychotic break that stripped him of intent. Experts debated. Edibles hit harder and longer than smoked marijuana, especially for novices, but his low THC levels complicated the narrative. The case dragged on for nearly 3 years, a legal limbo that kept the family in purgatory. Richard, held in custody, refused interviews, his blue eyes now shadowed by regret in mugshots. Behind bars, he grappled with fragmented memories, the jump from the window, the fixation on numbers, the gun in his hand. "I didn't know it was my wife," he would later sob in a rare prison interview. "I thought it was somebody else. That's the only way I could have done it." He insisted the marijuana was to blame, a catastrophic reaction to a substance he didn't understand. Yet doubts lingered. Was this a convenient excuse for a man with a history of anger, financial woes pushing him to the edge? As trial loomed in 2017, the weight on the family grew unbearable. The boys, now 10, 14, and 16, faced the prospect of testifying against their father, a trauma no one wanted. Richard, perhaps seeing the toll, changed course. On February 3, 2017, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, accepting a sentence range of 25 to 30 years, plus a fine and mandatory 5-year parole. He relinquished custodial rights, allowing Marty and Wayne to adopt the children fully. All involved feel this is a fair resolution of a very complicated, tragic case, his attorney stated. The family did not want the case to go to trial given the personal and emotional toll. Sentencing came on April 7, 2017, just days before what would have been Chris's 47th birthday. The courtroom in Denver's Lindsay Flanagan Courthouse was heavy with emotion, spectators filling the benches as Judge Morris B. Hoffman presided. Richard, now 50, stood tearfully, his voice breaking as he addressed the court. "If I had not taken a marijuana edible, my wife Christine would be here today," he said, remorse etching his features. "Unknowingly, it was my hand that shot and killed her. I'm so sorry for becoming the monster I was supposed to protect them from." Friends spoke on his behalf. One called him not an evil man, who sought relief and lost everything. But Chris's family laid bare the devastation. Marty, tears streaming, dismissed his apology as too little, too late. "We have heard nothing from him for 3 years," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. She described raising the boys, the nightly stories to soothe Andrew's nightmares, the enormous responsibility of ensuring they reached college amid their own aging. A letter from one son was read aloud. "Dear Mom, I know you can hear me. I know I can hear you." Tammy, Chris's sister, spoke of the void left behind, the sister she lost to a senseless act. The judge, weighing the plea deal's maximum, sentenced Richard to 30 years in prison, plus 5 years of parole, ensuring he remained behind bars until the boys were well into adulthood. Richard was transferred to Bent County Correctional Facility, a stark concrete world far from Denver's mountains. There, in a visitor lounge with vending machines and watchful guards, he finally spoke out in 2018, his graying goatee and worn teeth betraying the toll of incarceration. He cried over family photos, lamenting the loss of embraces, the scent of clean pillows. "I miss everything about my boys," he said, envisioning a reunion where they ran to him across the grass. He blamed the edible entirely, calling it the worst decision of his life, though he understood the skepticism. "I just lost myself. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what I was doing." The aftermath rippled outward. The boys pursued a wrongful death lawsuit against Gaia's Garden LLC, the candy's maker, and nutritional elements, alleging inadequate warnings about edibles' risks, paranoia, psychosis, hallucinations. It was the nation's first such suit against a recreational marijuana company, highlighting the industry's growing pains in Colorado. The case argued the 100 milligrams THC dose was excessive, though Richard's low blood levels muddied the waters. Attorneys for the companies dismissed it as baseless. Marijuana doesn't cause violence. The person with the mental illness caused the violence. The suit sought justice for the boys, a measure of accountability in a tragedy born from legalization's uncharted territories. For Marty and Wayne, life became a delicate balance of grief and guardianship. They worried about their health, the boys' futures, Tammy ready to step in if needed. "We're just a regular family," Marty said, though their resilience was remarkable. Balloon releases marked Chris's birthdays, simple acts to keep her spirit alive. The boys grew, carrying invisible scars. Andrew sleeping alone some nights, Ethan and Aiden finding strength in routine. Richard's absence was a double-edged sword, safety from the man who shattered their world, yet the loss of a father. The case of Richard Kirk became a cautionary tale, fueling debates on marijuana edibles safety. Regulations tightened. Packaging now mandates clearer warnings, childproofing, and dosage limits. Yet for the Kirks, it was more than policy. It was a family's unraveling, a mother's life stolen in a haze of confusion and violence. In quiet moments, Marty reflected on Chris's warmth, her sister's laughter, the what-ifs that haunted them. Richard, in his cell, clung to hope of forgiveness, though the bars reminded him daily of the irreparable harm. The boys, forging ahead, embodied resilience, their mother's love a guiding light through the darkness. Years passed, and the neighborhood healed, but the echo of that gunshot lingered, a reminder of how fragile normalcy can be. Richard's projected release, far in the future, loomed as a distant shadow. For now, the family focused on tomorrow, honoring Chris by living fully, their story a testament to endurance amid unimaginable loss. Story 7. The sprawling Los Angeles mansion, a monument to a hip-hop emperor's reign, basked in the deceptive tranquility of a late March afternoon in 2024. The manicured lawns of Holmby Hills, a neighborhood that whispered wealth, were suddenly pierced by the wail of sirens. Unmarked government vehicles, a fleet of them, swarmed the property, their dark-windowed presence a stark omen. Men in tactical gear, bearing the bold letters of Homeland Security investigations, poured out, their movements precise and purposeful. The gates of the kingdom were being breached. Simultaneously, a similar scene was unfolding 3,000 miles away, under the balmy Miami sky. Another of Sean Diddy Combs' opulent residences was being methodically dismantled by federal agents. The synchronized raids, a show of overwhelming force, were the culmination of a silent, sprawling investigation that had been gathering momentum in the shadows, far from the flashbulbs and adoring crowds that had defined Combs' life for 3 decades. At the Miami Opa-locka Executive Airport, Combs himself was intercepted. As he prepared to board a private jet for a planned vacation, federal agents approached. There was no dramatic arrest, not yet. Instead, they questioned him, their faces impassive, their inquiries a quiet storm brewing. They seized his electronic devices, his phones, the digital repositories of his life's secrets, before allowing him to depart. The message was clear. The world of Sean Combs, the self-made billionaire, the cultural icon, was under siege. He was a free man, but he was a man under a microscope, his every move, past and present, subject to the unblinking eye of the law. The investigation had been triggered by a tremor that had shaken the foundations of his empire just months earlier. In November 2023, a lawsuit was filed that sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. The plaintiff was Cassandra Cassie Ventura, a singer and Combs' former long-term girlfriend. Her complaint was a harrowing tale of a decade-long nightmare, a narrative of rape, trafficking, and brutal physical abuse. The lawsuit was settled out of court with surprising speed, but the dam had broken. The silence that had long shrouded the darker side of Diddy's world was shattered. What followed was a torrent. More women came forward, their stories echoing Cassie's, painting a chillingly consistent portrait of a predator lurking behind the suave facade of a music mogul. The accusations spanned decades, from the early 1990s to recent years. They spoke of sexual misconduct, of drug-facilitated assaults, of a man who allegedly used his immense power and influence to manipulate and violate. The whisper network that had long existed in the music industry, the hushed conversations about Diddy's freak-offs, his notorious drug-fueled parties, was now a deafening roar in the public sphere. By October 2024, lawyers announced they were preparing to file as many as 120 more lawsuits, some from men, some from minors. The sheer volume of the allegations was staggering, a testament to a long-festering wound. The federal government had taken notice. The Department of Homeland Security, an agency usually associated with counterterrorism and border security, was now leading a sex trafficking investigation into one of the most famous men in America. The raids on his homes were not just for show, they were a treasure hunt for evidence. And what they found, according to reports, was a trove of incriminating material. Illegally modified AR-15 rifles, drugs, and perhaps most bizarrely, over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. The items seemed to corroborate the darkest rumors about Combs' private life, suggesting a world of organized debauchery and potential coercion. The culmination of this massive investigation came in the form of a sweeping federal indictment. The charges were a bombshell: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation for the purposes of prostitution. The government was not just accusing Sean Combs of individual crimes. They were accusing him of running a criminal enterprise. They were deploying the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a powerful legal weapon forged to dismantle the mafia, against a titan of the entertainment industry. The indictment, a formal document from the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, laid out the prosecution's case in stark, damning detail. It alleged that Combs had used his vast business empire, Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs Enterprises, Combs Global, as a front for a criminal organization. This Combs enterprise, the indictment claimed, was designed to satisfy his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his illicit conduct. His employees, from security guards to high-ranking executives, were allegedly complicit, acting as his intermediaries, facilitating his abuse, and cleaning up the aftermath. The indictment painted a picture of a man who used his power to lure women into his orbit, where they were allegedly coerced into sexual acts with threats, violence, and drugs. The now infamous freak-offs were described not as consensual parties, but as highly orchestrated performances of sexual activity, where women were forced to participate with male commercial sex workers while Combs watched. The indictment detailed a pattern of physical abuse, referencing a 2016 hotel surveillance video that showed Combs kicking, dragging, and throwing a vase at a woman. The government alleged that this was not the behavior of a flawed individual, but the calculated actions of a racketeer, a man who ran his life and his business like a mob boss. Sean Combs, a man who had built an empire on an image of cool confidence and relentless ambition, pleaded not guilty to all charges. He assembled a formidable legal team, led by the high-profile defense attorney Mark Agnifilo. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation, a trial that would put not just a man, but an entire culture on display. The trial, United States of America versus Sean Combs, began in the spring of 2025 in a federal district court in Lower Manhattan. The courtroom was a theater of high drama, the air thick with anticipation. On one side sat the prosecution team, armed with a mountain of evidence and a roster of witnesses ready to tell their stories. On the other side sat Sean Combs, his face a mask of composure, his expensive suit a shield against the storm of accusations. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of the women who said they had been his victims. The star witness was Cassie Ventura. Her testimony was a harrowing journey back into a relationship she described as a prison. She spoke of a decade of control, of physical beatings that left her bruised and broken, of being forced into sexual acts with male prostitutes. Her voice, at times trembling but steady, filled the courtroom with the weight of her trauma. She recounted how Combs allegedly controlled every aspect of her life, from her career to her social interactions. Her testimony painted a picture of a man who was not just an abuser, but a puppet master, pulling the strings of those around him. Another woman, identified only as Jane Doe, took the stand to share her own story of abuse. Her testimony corroborated Cassie's, adding another layer to the prosecution's narrative of a systematic pattern of predatory behavior. The prosecution presented evidence to support their claims: text messages, travel records, and the testimony of former employees who said they were tasked with procuring drugs and sex workers for Combs. The defense, for their part, did not try to portray Sean Combs as a saint. Their strategy was more nuanced, more audacious. They admitted he was a flawed man, a man who indulged in unconventional sexual practices, who used illegal drugs, who had committed acts of domestic violence. But, they argued, he was not a racketeer. He was not the kingpin of a criminal enterprise. Mark Agnifilo, in his powerful closing argument, painted a picture of a man whose life was a whirlwind of excess, a man whose wealth and fame had created a world where boundaries were blurred. He argued that the freak-offs were consensual, that the women who participated were willing participants in a hedonistic lifestyle. He attacked the credibility of the witnesses, suggesting they were motivated by money and fame. He tried to separate the man from the mogul, the personal failings from the alleged criminal conspiracy. He argued that while Combs' behavior may have been morally reprehensible, it was not criminal under the RICO Act. He was a violent man, Agnifilo conceded in a dramatic moment, but he was not the head of an organized crime family. The jury, a group of ordinary citizens tasked with an extraordinary responsibility, deliberated for 3 days. The city and much of the world held its breath. The fate of a cultural icon hung in the balance. The jury's decision, when it finally came, was a complex one, a verdict that left both sides claiming a partial victory. On July 2, 2025, the jury found Sean Combs not guilty of the most serious charges: racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking. The prosecution's bold attempt to use the RICO Act against a music mogul had failed. The jury had not been convinced that his business empire was a criminal enterprise in the legal sense. But Combs was not a free man. The jury found him guilty on 2 counts of transportation for the purposes of prostitution, a violation of the Mann Act. The verdict, while an acquittal on the most explosive charges, was a conviction nonetheless. It was a stain on his legacy, a legal branding that would follow him forever. In the aftermath of the verdict, Combs' legal team immediately moved for him to be released on bail pending sentencing. This is his first conviction, and it pertains to a prostitution offense, so he should be released under suitable conditions, Agnifilo argued. But the judge, U.S. District Judge Arun Subramanian, denied the request. He cited Combs' own admission of violent behavior towards his former partners as a reason to keep him behind bars. The man who had once ruled a global empire was now a federal inmate, stripped of his freedom, his future uncertain. In the weeks that followed, Combs' legal team launched a final, desperate push to have his conviction overturned. They argued that the Mann Act, a law passed in 1910 to combat the forced transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes, had been unjustly applied in his case. They argued that his conduct, while perhaps distasteful to some, was not criminal. As of late September 2025, the judge was still weighing his decision. Sean Diddy Combs, the man who had once proclaimed "can't stop, won't stop," was now at a standstill, his fate in the hands of the very system he had once seemed to be above. The trial of Sean Combs was more than just the story of one man's fall from grace. It was a story about power, about celebrity, about the dark underbelly of an industry that often celebrates excess. It was a story about the women who found the courage to speak out, to challenge a man who had seemed untouchable. And it was a story that was far from over. The final chapter, the one that would determine the ultimate price Sean Combs would pay for his actions, had yet to be written. The world was still watching, waiting for the final curtain to fall on the spectacular, and now tragic, life of a modern-day mogul.